It was 3 in the morning when Earl Dodd stepped outside his farmhouse in rural Nebraska, expecting nothing more than the familiar silence of open land and a sky full of stars. He had done this 1,000 times before, checking on his cattle, breathing the cold air, listening to the crickets. But on this particular night in the summer of 1978, the crickets were not chirping. Everything was silent, unnaturally silent. Then the light appeared, not a light you could explain away as a passing airplane or a distant vehicle on the highway. No, this light hovered. It pulsed. It moved in directions that defied every law of physics Earl had ever been taught. It descended toward his field, cast a beam of pure white luminescence across his cattle pen, and then, in less than 2 seconds, vanished without a sound. Earl stood frozen for 6 full minutes before he could move. When he finally went to check the field the next morning, 3 of his cattle were dead. Their internal organs had been surgically removed with a precision that no known human tool could replicate. No blood, no tracks, no explanation. Earl Dodd was not alone. His encounter was not a one-time anomaly buried in a forgotten corner of history. Across rural America, rural England, rural Australia, and dozens of remote farming regions across the globe, hundreds of witnesses, isolated, credible, ordinary people with nothing to gain and everything to lose, have reported encounters so similar, so structurally identical, that the odds of mass coincidence collapse entirely. Encounters that defy logic. Encounters that science has never fully explained. And encounters that governments have gone to extraordinary lengths to keep buried. This is the UFO Files. And today we are going deep into the countryside, where the lights come down, where the animals disappear, and where the truth is far stranger than anything Hollywood ever imagined. To understand why rural UFO encounters are so uniquely terrifying and so uniquely credible, you first need to understand the world in which they happen. The countryside is not like the city. There are no neon signs to mistake for hovering craft, no drone swarms, no crowds with smartphones filming every moment. In the rural world, what you see with your own eyes is almost all you have. And what these witnesses saw changed them forever. In the post-war decades of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, America's farmlands were quiet. Families worked enormous stretches of land largely cut off from the rapid modernization reshaping cities. Most rural communities had never seen a military aircraft up close, let alone something capable of hovering silently at 300 feet and then accelerating to supersonic speed in under a second. These were not people predisposed to fantasy. And small-town sheriffs, people who could read the weather, track animal behavior, and identify a distant combine harvester by its engine sound. The last people on Earth likely to confuse a star with a structured craft, bearing rotating lights and leaving physical traces on the ground. And yet, the reports kept coming, decade after decade, continent after continent. The pattern was always identical. A rural area, an isolated witness, unusual silence before the appearance, a light or structured object defying conventional aerodynamics, physical evidence left behind, scorched soil, flattened crops, mutilated animals, electromagnetic interference, then the object vanishing at impossible speed. Something was happening out there, in the fields, in the dark, far from the cameras and the crowds. Let us start with one of the most well-documented rural encounters in recorded history. The Delphos Ring Incident, November 2nd, 1971. A farm outside Delphos, Kansas. 16-year-old Ronnie Johnson was tending to the family's sheep just after dusk when he heard an unusual rumbling sound from the direction of a grove of trees near the edge of the property. He turned and saw it, a mushroom-shaped object roughly 9 feet in diameter, hovering approximately 2 feet above the ground. It was illuminated from within by a multicolored pulsating light. The sheep were silent. The dogs had retreated to the barn. The air felt charged, almost electric. Ronnie stood and watched, unable to move, unable to speak, for an estimated 3 to 4 minutes. Then the object lit up brilliantly, emitted a sharp, blinding flash, and rose rapidly into the night sky, disappearing in seconds. Ronnie, partially blinded by the flash, ran to the farmhouse to get his parents, Irma and Darrell Johnson. By the time they came outside, the object was gone, but what it left behind was not. In the exact spot where the craft had hovered, there was a glowing ring on the ground, a perfect circle of luminescent soil, approximately 8 feet in diameter. When Irma Johnson touched the ring, her hand went numb, a numbness that reportedly lasted for weeks. The soil within the ring had been mysteriously hardened, changed in chemical composition, and was hydrophobic, meaning it repelled water, a property that natural soil simply does not possess. Scientists from multiple universities later tested the soil. Their findings were astonishing. The chemical changes in the soil were consistent with exposure to an intense energy source of unknown type. The luminescence was real, the hydrophobic quality was confirmed, no conventional explanation, no fertilizer, no chemical treatment, no natural phenomenon. could account for what had happened to that patch of Kansas earth. The Delphos Ring became one of the most physically documented pieces of UFO evidence in North American history. But Kansas was not alone. That same decade, Australian cattle ranchers in Queensland were reporting something equally disturbing. Circular impressions in their fields, not just burned grass, but structured depressions in the soil, as if something impossibly heavy had briefly rested there. The diameters were consistent, 12 to 20 feet. The depth of the impressions suggested a downward force of enormous magnitude. And in every case, the events had taken place at night, in isolated locations, with no witnesses except the rancher who discovered the aftermath in the morning. Then came the reports that changed everything, the animal mutilations. If the physical trace evidence was disturbing, the animal mutilation phenomenon was, and remains, deeply, profoundly horrifying in its precision and its mystery. Beginning in the late 1960s and accelerating dramatically through the 1970s, ranchers across the American West began discovering their livestock, primarily cattle, dead under circumstances that defied every forensic explanation available. The pattern was so consistent across thousands of cases spanning 20 states that it cannot be dismissed as coincidence. The animals were found with specific organs removed: the eyes, the tongue, the ears, the genitals, the rectum, and in many cases, sections of facial skin, all extracted with cuts. So precise that veterinarians and later FBI investigators described them as consistent with laser or high-heat surgical tools. Tools that, for most of the 1970s, did not commercially exist. There was no blood, not on the animals, not on the ground around them, as if the blood had been entirely drained or never allowed to fall. There were no tracks, no human footprints, no tire marks, no evidence of any ground-level approach. And in many cases, the soil directly beneath the carcass showed evidence of being compressed from above, as if the animal had been dropped from a significant height after the mutilations had occurred elsewhere. The FBI formally investigated beginning in 1975, under the direction of Agent Kenneth Rommel. Their final report, released in 1980, concluded that the mutilations were the work of natural predators and scavengers. The scientific and ranching communities immediately and overwhelmingly rejected this conclusion. Veterinary pathologists pointed out that natural predators do not make straight cauterized incisions. Scavengers do not selectively remove specific organs while leaving the bulk of the carcass intact. And no predator known to science drains an animal of its blood without leaving a trace. Senator Floyd Haskell of Colorado wrote directly to the FBI in 1975, demanding a federal investigation, stating that the phenomenon had, and these are his words, caused genuine terror in rural Colorado communities. Over 20,000 cases of animal mutilation have been reported and documented across North America since the 1960s. The phenomenon has also been reported in the United Kingdom, Brazil, Argentina, and Australia. In every instance, the geographic correlation with UFO sighting reports in the same time frame in the same regions is striking. Imagine if this happened near a major city. Imagine the media coverage. Imagine the government response. But because it happened in fields and on ranches, in places where voices carry far and audiences are small, the world largely looked away. The ranchers did not look away. They could not afford to. When investigators finally began taking rural UFO encounters seriously, what they found opened more questions than it answered. The first serious government-funded investigation into the UFO phenomenon was Project Blue Book, run by the United States Air Force from 1952 to 1969. Over 17 years, the project investigated 12,618 UFO sightings. Of those, 701 were officially classified as unidentified, meaning even the Air Force, with all its resources, could not explain what people had seen. When the project was closed in 1969, the official conclusion was that UFOs posed no threat to national security. Clean, and deeply suspicious to anyone who had read the internal documents, because the internal documents told a very different story. Declassified communications showed that military pilots, trained observers flying sophisticated aircraft, had repeatedly reported objects that outmaneuvered their jets, disappeared at impossible velocities, and reflected radar in ways inconsistent with any known aircraft. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the Air Force's own scientific consultant on Project Blue Book, became increasingly convinced that something genuinely unexplained was occurring. He developed his now famous categorization system, close encounters of the first, second, and third kind, specifically to classify rural ground-level encounters, involving physical traces and direct object observation. He pointed specifically to cases like Delphos, where evidence could be independently measured, tested, and verified by witnesses with no motivation to fabricate. Then there is the theory that refuses to go away, regardless of how many official reports attempt to bury it. The extraterrestrial hypothesis. The idea that what rural witnesses are observing are structured craft of non-human origin, conducting systematic study of Earth's biology, including its animal population. At first, this seems outlandish, but examine it purely on the basis of the evidence, and the problems with dismissing it accumulate rapidly. The surgical precision of animal mutilations is consistent with biological sampling. The geographic patterns, disproportionately concentrated in areas far from population centers, are consistent with a study designed to minimize contact with large human groups. If craft of non-human origin have been systematically visiting Earth's rural regions for at least 7 decades, why have they never made definitive contact? Why always the margins? Why always the farms and the fields? And never a clear, unambiguous appearance that settles the question once and for all? That question does not have a comfortable answer. Here is where the story stops being about individual encounters and starts being about something much larger, something that touches every one of us. In 2017, the United States Department of Defense officially acknowledged the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, AATIP, a secret government program running since 2007 with a budget of $22 million, publicly stating that evidence gathered by his team suggested a classified program to reverse engineer that technology. Grush stated that individuals with direct knowledge had come forward under legally protected whistleblower status. Let that sink in for a moment. These are not farmers in Nebraska. These are senior intelligence officials testifying before Congress, under oath, with penalties for perjury, stating that the phenomena rural witnesses have been reporting for 70 years are real or physical, and have been known to segments of the U.S. government. If that chain connecting Earl Dodd's mutilated cattle in 1978 to David Grush's testimony in 2023 is as direct as it appears, the implications are staggering. Rural communities across the world have been unknowing participants in something far beyond their understanding. The ridicule heaped on farmers and ranchers for decades was not accidental. It served a purpose. It kept the questions from accumulating into an avalanche no government could survive. And whatever is operating in those fields at night, landing, leaving rings in the soil, taking biological samples, then disappearing at velocities that make our fastest jets look like bicycles. It is still out there, still operating, still conducting whatever mission brought it here. If this level of activity occurred over a major city, civilization would pause. But in the countryside, in the dark, with witnesses who know they will not be believed, it continues, quietly, systematically, without interference. There is something uniquely isolating about the rural UFO experience that the urban mind struggles to fully grasp. When you are a farmer, standing in a dark field at midnight and something beyond human comprehension descends from the sky in front of you, you are not just confronted with the unknown. You are confronted with the absolute smallness of everything you have ever believed about your place in the universe, your town, your neighbors, your government, your church. The entire framework of meaning you have spent a lifetime constructing, in a single moment, all of it becomes suddenly, terrifyingly uncertain. And then the object leaves. You are alone in the dark again. Earl Dodd never spoke publicly about his 1978 encounter. His daughter gave an interview 30 years later describing how her father changed after that night. He became withdrawn. He sold the farm within a year. He never slept well again. He had no language for what he had seen, and without language, there was no way to process it. No way to integrate it into a life that had previously made sense. This is the human cost that never makes it into the reports and the scientific papers. The psychological wreckage left behind in people who were simply going about their ordinary rural lives when something extraordinary intruded without invitation and without explanation. And what is most unsettling is this. Science, for all its extraordinary power, has not given us a framework capable of addressing what these witnesses describe. The scientific method requires repeatable experiments. UFO encounters are neither repeatable nor controllable. They leave behind evidence that is suggestive but not definitive, witnesses whose testimony is compelling but not scientifically sufficient on its own. We are left in a liminal space between what we know and what we cannot yet explain. For the men and women who stood in those fields and watched lights defy gravity, that liminal space is not an intellectual curiosity. It is the place where their certainty about reality shattered and never fully reassembled. We still do not know what they saw, and that after all the investigations, the declassified documents, and the congressional hearings, is what makes this genuinely terrifying. The rural UFO encounter phenomenon has left a legacy that extends far beyond the individual witnesses and the specific cases we have discussed today. Scientifically, the accumulated physical trace evidence from decades of rural encounters represents one of the largest unexplained datasets in modern science. Soil samples from dozens of landing sites consistently show chemical anomalies that remain unexplained. The animal mutilation phenomenon drove advances in veterinary forensic science as researchers attempted, and largely failed, to find conventional explanations. The very effort to explain these cases pushed the boundaries of what we understand about electromagnetic effects on biological tissue and the chemistry of soil under extreme energy exposure. Culturally, the rural UFO phenomenon fundamentally shaped how modern societies think about the relationship between official truth and experiential truth, to the accumulated weight of testimony from ordinary rural people who refused to be entirely silent. The witnesses who came forward, knowing they would be ridiculed, knowing their credibility would be attacked, created the evidentiary record that made official acknowledgement ultimately unavoidable. Globally, we are now in a moment of genuine institutional reckoning. NASA has established a formal UAP study group. The Pentagon created the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. Multiple governments have declassified their UFO investigation archives. The scientific community, for the first time in decades, is treating these questions as legitimate inquiry rather than fringe curiosity. All of it built on the foundation of farmers and ranchers and isolated rural witnesses who looked up at the night sky and saw something that should not have been there. Their experiences were real. Their evidence was real. And the questions they raised, questions that governments spent decades trying to suppress, have proven to be among the most important questions the 21st century will have to face. So here we are, 7 decades after the first wave of rural encounters began reshaping the lives of ordinary people in fields and on farms across the world. 7 decades of evidence, 7 decades of suppression, 7 decades of slow, grinding official acknowledgement that something real and physical and not yet understood, has been operating in our skies and on our land. What do we actually know? We know the encounters are real. Physical evidence has been left behind and independently verified. We know the witnesses are credible across every cultural and socioeconomic background that has produced them. We know that governments, including the United States government, took these phenomena seriously behind closed doors while publicly dismissing them for decades. And we know that whatever is responsible for the Delphos ring, for 20,000 documented animal mutilations, for generations of isolated witnesses whose lives were permanently altered, it operates with a technology and an intelligence we do not fully understand. The countryside at night is vast and dark and impossibly quiet. And somewhere out there, in fields that look exactly like the ones Earl Dodd walked in 1978, the lights are still appearing. Whatever is behind them has never been in a hurry. It has all the time it needs. The real question, the one that should keep all of us awake, is not whether these encounters are real. And why? After all these decades of observation and surgical precision and physical evidence left behind like calling cards, have they still not told us? Whatever happened in those fields, humanity was left with questions it cannot answer. Next time, we may not even get the chance to ask them. History is full of moments like this. Moments that happened in the dark, far from cameras, witnessed only by people the world was not yet ready to believe. The rural UFO encounter phenomenon is one of the most documented, most physically evidenced, and most suppressed mysteries in human history, and we have barely scratched the surface. If you want to go deeper into the government programs, the declassified files, the witnesses, who changed history by refusing to stay silent, subscribe to UFO Files. The truth is out there. It always has been, and it is far stranger than you have been told.